Greetings, everyone. My name is Sharon McKinley, and I am the Senior Consultant with the NRC for In-Home Services, funded by the Department of Health and Human Services Children's Bureau. On behalf of NRC for In-Home Services, I would like to welcome you to Promoting Safe and Stable Families Peer Learning Call. Today's topic is Protective Factors in Child Welfare. Before we get started, can we find out who is on the phone? If you can state your name and what agency and state you're calling from, that would be very helpful. Can we start with Virginia first, please?
Yes, my name is Trevor Brown, calling from Virginia, from the law offices of Sabine Brown.
Okay, thank you. And from North Carolina?
Hi, this is Arletta Lambert with the North Carolina Division of Social Services Child Welfare Services Section.
Thank you. Before we introduce our presenters, I would like to ask that you all would mute your phones so that we will not hear any background noises. And to do that, you hit *6. And then we will allow time at the end of the presentations for your questions, your comments, and we'll probably do a little interactive polling questions also during that period of time. So if you can, just *6 your phone right now. Thank you. At the end of the presentation, we will also send out the materials from today's presentation, as well as we'll post the webcast on the NRC for In-Home Services website. So regardless of whether or not those who weren't on the call, they'll be able to access the information once it is posted. And then also, for those of you who are on the call, we would like for you to do a brief little survey. I'll be sending it out, just so that you can kind of give us some feedback and let us know what other topics you would like for us to have a discussion on in the future for this fiscal coming year. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start this by introducing our presenters for today. Today we have on the call Nilofer Hassan. She leads the Strengthening Families Initiative, which works with states and national partner organizations to improve outcomes for parents and children by and through the Protective Factors framework. She also helps advance the Center for the Study of Social Policy's work to improve conditions for families in low-income neighborhoods by supporting efforts to mobilize communities to achieve and sustain results and build the capacity of resident leaders. Next, we also have Kelly Perrier. She is the Assistant Director of Adolescent Services for the New Jersey Department of Children and Family Services. Prior to joining the office, Kelly worked at a youth development agency. Throughout her career in both private and public agencies, she oversaw data collection and analysis efforts in order to measure and sustain program effectiveness. She has experience with organization development, competitive procurement of service, and program development. Kelly holds a bachelor's degree in social work from Temple University and a master's degree from Rutgers University and a PhD from Heller School of Social Policy at Brandeis University. And then finally we have Brenda Kensler. She has been with the Department of Human Services in Philadelphia for 28 years. She is currently administrator for the Family and Youth Engagement Center. She is also lead project manager for the implementation of Strengthening Families into the Improving Outcomes for Children initiative in Philadelphia. Brenda has worked in investigations and supervised all parent education programs for DHS during her time there. I would like to welcome them, and I will turn the presentation over now to Nilofer.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. And because I do know that it is a small group today, and because I also know that some of the people who are on the phone as audience are also doing some very active work in their own states to integrate a protective factors approach into their child welfare work. I know, Arletta, you were on the phone, and I know that North Carolina has been very active. Trevor, I know that at least in some of the counties in Virginia, that there's a lot of activity going on. So I want to encourage you all. It's a small group. We really can have dialogue. So as we go, if you have questions or comments or, this is what's happening in our states, please feel free to jump in. So I'm going to go very quickly, and the idea was just to update you all on what is happening around the country around using a protective factors approach in child welfare practice. So I'm going to speak to some of the larger national work that's going on, give some examples from the work that we, CSSP, have been doing in particular with states, and then we have Brenda and Kelly who are going to be talking about their own experience at the state level. So just very early, Sharon, can you move to that first slide with the arrows? So just to set some initial framing, when we say a protective factors approach in child welfare, what do we mean? Protective factors approaches really are, there are many different approaches in the field, but what they're really based on is this idea of let's look at the existing research and literature, and let's really understand the qualities of families that are able to succeed despite risk and crisis. And let's use that understanding to think about what are the strengths that we need to build in families that are going to help to mitigate and offset risk. So protective factors, if we think of them, are conditions or attributes of individuals that will help to mitigate risk. We at CSSP also talk about protective and promotive factors. Protective factors are those things that are associated with strengths in the face of specific risks, right? And promotive factors are things that are known to be linked to the achieving of good outcomes. So when we talk a little bit about the Strengthening Families protective factors, the Youth Thrive protective factors, what you'll see is that they're both protective and promotive factors. But in this particular context of this call, we're going to be talking about protective factors that are in play in the field of child welfare. So those protective factors frameworks that are specifically designed around reducing the risk of child maltreatment. So Sharon, if you go to the next slide. So as I said, there's many protective factors frameworks that are out there. We've got the new work ACYF has been doing on their literature review of kids that are in risk, Essentials from Early Childhood that's going on for the CDC, Strengthening Families and Youth Thrive that are coming from CSSP. But we've also got things like Communities of Care that comes from the substance abuse sector, and the Search Institute's 40 Developmental Assets that comes from the Positive Youth Development literature. Sharon, if you can just automate this slide a little bit. So press your key 3 times now. Okay, so in this webinar, we're going to focus on the first 3, the ACYF Protective Factors Literature Review, Essentials for Early Childhood, and Strengthening Families and Youth Thrive. And the reason is that those 3 frameworks are specifically associated with protective factors that are associated with either the reduction of child maltreatment or well-being for children in care. So Sharon, can you go on? Okay, so this is the conceptual model that is coming out of ACYF's new literature review about for kids that are in care. So ACYF was very concerned about, let's look at the populations that we are responsible for, children and adolescents who are victims of or at risk for abuse and neglect, runaway and homeless youth, youth in or transitioning out of foster care, children and youth exposed to domestic violence, pregnant and parenting teens. So they were very interested in, let's look at the rich literature that is specific to these 5 groups that we're responsible for. And they recently completed a very detailed literature review of all the literature that was available for those populations and came up with the conceptual model that you see. So the outcome they're focused on is well-being, social emotional well-being for the kids who have experienced, who are part of child welfare systems, essentially. And you'll see that they're looking at protective factors at 3 levels: community levels, relationship level, and individual level. We have done a crosswalk of the articles from their literature review to our Strengthening Families and Youth Thrive protective factors, which are based on a universal frame. And what is very interesting about all of this is while there are some differences, we also see a tremendous amount of consistency about what's promoting well-being for these kids who are in care and what promotes well-being for kids, for a universal population of kids. So we see the same emphasis when kids are really young on essentially their social emotional, their self-regulation, their own sort of social behavioral skills. We also see the importance when kids are very young of parenting competencies. And then as kids get older, we really see that there's this evolving focus on their own internal capacities, on caring adults and peers around them. So it's interesting stuff. At this point, the literature review on this is hopefully going to be released to the field in the beginning of next year. And at that point, there will also be a lot more information about how some of this pegs to other frameworks that are available in the field. So, Sharon, next slide. The other framework that is sort of new to the field but is just starting to be used is CDCs Essentials for Early Childhood. And they're really focused on their protective factors are these safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. CDC was very, Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, was very concerned about child maltreatment as a pathway to poor health outcomes for kids. And so they looked at all the literature around child maltreatment and what would prevent child maltreatment and came up with this framework of safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. The CDC's framework is less focused on the protective factors themselves than what they see as the processes that help build these safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And so this left-hand column, which is around raising awareness and commitment, using data to inform actions, norm change in programs, and policies that build safe, stable, nurturing relationships are really the focus of sort of the action component of the CDC work. And CDC has just funded 5 sites, Massachusetts, Colorado, California, Washington, and North Carolina, to look at how they build these essentials for early childhood. And they're also trying to build a larger learning network of states that are going to be participating in the Essentials project. Next slide, Sharon. So at CSSP, we actually have 2 protective factors framework that we are using in the field. The most widely known, the most widely used, and the oldest at this point is Strengthening Families. And Strengthening Families really looks at it. It's based on the research literature from children from birth to 8 years old, and really looks at all of the early childhood. The early brain development literature, and really focus on those protective factors that are associated for well-being for those young children. And what's not surprising, given that these are often very young children and the parental environment is extremely important for children of that age, is that what we see as having very strong relevance is primarily parental protective factors, as well as these early social, emotional, regulatory issues, self-regulatory issues for children. But then as children get older, we see this importance in focusing on the child's own protective factors. And our newly developed work, which Kelly's going to talk a little bit more about, is called Youth Thrive. And it really focuses on what the new research is telling us about adolescent brain development and how we can build protective factors for children who are in that 11 to 26 range. So we see these two initiatives as working together because to a certain extent they're focused on what can we do to build parent capacity, what can we do to build the child's own capacity, but to really support those well-being outcomes for kids and families and the reduction of child abuse and neglect. So Sharon, if you move to the next slide. Strengthening Families and Youth Thrive use a somewhat common framework of 5 protective factors, which are resilience. So in Strengthening Families, we look at the parents' resilience, their ability to bounce back from stressful situations, their ability to parent effectively in stressful situations. In Youth Thrive, we're looking at some of the same concepts but for the youth. How do the youth have their own internal capacity and skills to respond to stress effectively? We're looking at social connections, and again, we have this divide between, in Strengthening Families, we're looking at the parent social connections. In Youth Thrive, we're looking at the youth social connections. But in both cases, we're not looking just at the quantity of those social connections, but the quality of those social connections, and whether or not they provide sort of instrumental social and emotional and support to the individual. We have concrete supports, which include whether or not individuals have access to services, but also whether or not they have the internal skills to have help-seeking behavior, to advocate for themselves, etc. And then knowledge of development. So not a surprise in the Strengthening Families framework that we have that the knowledge of parenting and child development is associated with good outcomes for children. We have a lot of information about also how that information is provided. But then what is very interesting is in the youth development field, we find that it is still important, and it is important for the caregivers and the youth themselves to understand sort of all of the changes that are going on in the adolescent brain. And finally, we have this category of developmental competence. And in both cases, this is for the child itself. So in Strengthening Families, we talk about the fact that even the very youngest kids, the infants in the arms, are engaged in very important social emotional activities, building block activities like building attachment, like learning to respond when others communicate with them or looking someone in the eye. And that all of these are very crucial for the child's ongoing development, and so they're an important protective factor. And then in youth, the issues are more complex because their development is more complex, but those fundamental skills of self-control, self-regulation, ability to communicate with others, again, are very foundational to the good outcomes. Okay, Sharon, you want to move on? I'm trying to go very, very fast because we have so much to cover. So this is just some of our Strengthening Families data from last year, and I'm going to suggest that folks who are interested in this might want to look at it after the webinar. But what it shows us is just the variety of strategies that are being used across states and how many states are using these strategies. And I included our child welfare strategies, but also our child abuse and neglect prevention work and how states are using protective factors in home visiting. So I'm going to go to the next slide, Sharon, and I'm going to go very quickly through these slides, which are really giving some of the examples of what's the work going on the ground. So prevention and diversion, we know that actually at this point the majority of states have aligned things like their CBCAP funding and their prevention dollars to protective factors, so that they're actually providing funding to programs specifically to build protective factors with families. We know that in a number of states they're using protective factors with their differential response strategies. so that families that are moved into a differential response and referred to community providers are being served by community providers that are operating within a protective factors framework. We're just starting some work in Philadelphia, which is very interesting, on how the protective factors can be used in their hotline response, so that workers will actually be asking questions related to the protective factors, and as they make recommendations to families who are being diverted from the system, they're using a protective factors frame for some of those things. I'm going to move on to the next slide. I'm just going to pepper some examples from each of these rather than go through everything on the slide. So anyway, in intake and investigation, what we're looking at in a number of places is revising intake and investigation tools to include questions on protective factors. We're also looking with states and including some trauma screening questions and flags for developmental delays. And then in the intake and investigation work, what we've seen is a lot of interest because so many states are also using a protective capacities framework and using that with their intake and investigation, that we're doing a lot of work to help workers understand how protective factors and protective capacities align and can work together and support each other, and what the distinctions are between the two. Because the language is so close, we really need to help workers understand how to work with these things together. Okay, next slide, Sharon. In the case planning, in a number of states and in a number of different ways, we're looking at revising assessment tools so that when families receive a family assessment, when they go into case planning and they're getting a family assessment as that first building block for developing a family plan, that they're actually being assessed in ways that assess them not just on their risks but also on their protective factors. So what this looks like from state to state varies in a number of ways. In the state of Utah, they're using a version of something that looks like the FAST, that builds off of the FAST, and we are doing some adaptations with them that are linking a protective factors related item on the scale of responses, so that we have plus ends of protective factors that will be assessed. In other states, we have specific assessment tools that are looking at protective factors. And then let me see, what else would I pull out of here? In Michigan, they've done some very simple adaptation to their case planning tools to include information on protective factors. And then in Philadelphia, we've been doing some work on looking at, they're using teaming as a core strategy and looking at how protective factors can connect to that. I should stop giving Philadelphia examples because Brenda's going to talk. I'm going to stop from that one, Brenda. Okay, in-home care. In a number of states, they're looking at using a protective factors framework in their in-home cases. Utah is one in specific that we've been working with, and so we're really talking with them about training because they want to make sure that their in-home workers have the capacity to use themselves as an effective tool to interact with families in a way that builds protective factors. So we're talking about training, but we're also talking about shifts in supervisory tools, brown bags, videos and activities that we can do with workers so that it would build their capacity to really think about when I'm in a home and I've got 20 minutes with a parent, how can I, in the course of doing the work that I'm doing, do it in a way that will build protective factors. The other thing that is very interesting, and I'm going to leave Brenda to talk about, is how parent cafes can be used as a strategy to support those families who are in-home services. Out-of-home care, it looks a lot like the work that's happening in-home care, but the thing that is an addition in out-of-home care is that we're really looking at the protective factors framework not just as a framework for how we support birth families in the system, but also how we support resource families. So foster families, adoptive families, kinship families, that we're recognizing that that all of these families are under stress. And so if we can use the protective factors framework to build the capacities of these families, we can help their capacity, we can help create a stable placement for children when they're in placement. We're going to increase stability when children go into adoption and aftercare. The particular project that I'm excited about that we're going to be starting some work on is in Arlington, Virginia, where they have a model called Building Bridges, where they very intentionally try to link their foster families with their birth families in ways that are mentoring and supportive of those birth families' skill and capacity building. And we're going to be looking at how the protective factors framework can support that underlying work to engage foster families and birth families in supportive relationships. You've got tremendous feedback. Okay.
Okay. Let me just ask, is anyone on the phone that's not muted? If you're not muted, please do star 6, just so that we won't hear any background noise.
And it's
Star 6 to mute your phone.
to mute my phone, I'm sorry. This is to be around.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk about the last piece, which is permanency, exit, and aftercare. That the last piece that we're really interested in looking at, and that we think this is a very useful framework for, and this actually came up in a conversation we had in North Carolina yesterday, is the potential of this framework as a framework for thinking about our aftercare relationships with families, and how do we really ensure that when families leave the system, whether it's a birth parent having a child returned home or it's an adoptive parent, that we're really thinking about what are the relationships we build at the community level so that there's ongoing support for those families, having those protective factors in place in order to ensure their long-term stability. And I know this is also a piece that Brenda will talk a bit about in a second. So I am going to pause for a second, and I think we're going to go straight to Kelly, and then we'll go back to questions. Is that right, Sharon?
We're going to go through, after Kelly, we'll do Brenda, and then we'll do questions.
Yep.
Okay.
So thank you, Nilofer. This is Kelly. Am I up?
Yes, ma'am.
Hey. Greetings, everybody. I'm Kelly Puryear. I'm the Assistant Director for Adolescent Services here in New Jersey as part of the Department of Children and Families, and I bring you greetings from the very icy Garden State. And so, as Nilofer mentioned in her comments earlier, we are using in our department the Youth Thrive portion of the framework in our work in adolescent services. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about New Jersey, talk a little bit about kind of how we fit in the larger child welfare system here, and then talk a little bit about a piece of work that I think is helpful for folks to understand how we're applying it. And so the slide you see now is just a context. So New Jersey's Department of Children and Families has 5 divisions. For those who maybe are familiar with New Jersey from years back, our child welfare system used to be called the Division of Youth and Family Services, or DISIS for short, and it's now called the Division of Child Protection and Permanency, and that's where really all of our child welfare services sit. The Office of Adolescent Services, which is the office that I work in, is considered a sister division to our CPMP office, and we provide technical support and consultation to case-carrying staff for young people aged 14 to 21. So in our system, what that means is we don't have case-carrying responsibility, but we inform and bring forth policy, practice guides, develop resources, and provide support to our purchase services, including resource placements in that 14 to 21 age range. If you could advance the slide, please. And so just a little bit about how the Youth Life Framework came to be. About a year and a half ago, our Commissioner, Allison Blake, convened a task force that we lovingly call the Task Force for Helping Youth Thrive in Placement, or HITIP, to really look at, given some federal guidance that had come out, given the Youth Thrive Framework, how can we really re-envision and reinvigorate our services for 14 to 21-year-olds. And the goal, as it's listed on the slide, is to really use the Youth Thrive Framework to identify and implement strategies to really look at systematic cultural change, really focusing on the 14 to 21-year-olds. And for the purpose of this piece of the work, the 14 to 21-year-olds in out-of-home care. And I should say in New Jersey, the child welfare system goes to 21. So at the age of 18, a young person can continue to keep their case open up until they're age 21. Can you advance the slide, please? Okay, there we go. And so Nilüfer mentioned the promotive and protective factors, and I don't know if you can see it well, but the slide that's up now talks about the 5 categories of promotive and protective factors on the left-hand column, and then on the right-hand column really outlines different examples of ways to kind of think about, operationalize, to really challenge you to think about how does a resource, a policy, a placement really either encourage or reinforce those promotive and protective factors. And so, for example, if you look at the the competencies piece, that last one, we really use the framework to say, one of my favorites, like how do our programs, how do our services, how do our staff help young people 14 to 21 explore their spirituality or consider recreational and hobby building activities as part of their core work. And that really came from a presentation that a CSSP staff member did that our director was at, where they really talked about, she talked about how there are 30 or so risk factors, and there are 100 or so promotive and protective factors. And for those of us who do the work on a consistent basis, that kind of feels like an odd ratio. Sometimes in our work it feels like there are far more risk factors to consider than there are promotive or protective. And so the framework really helped us to really drill down and say, let's not focus on, the risk factor, which we are comfortable with and often go to first, but how do we think more broadly around, in this context where maybe there is risk, there are also promotive and protective factors? Or how do we increase or create opportunities for those factors if they're not present to be brought to bear? And so if you could advance the slide. We have this very pretty report, which is an image up on your screen, and it's a PDF report, and I put the link at the bottom, and so please, at your leisure, feel free to download it, and it's very brief. And so it really outlines the recommendations that came forward. They came forward to our commissioner earlier this calendar year to really say, if we really want the case practice for 14 to 21-year-olds, for resources for that population, to really increase, encourage, promote promotive and protective factors, there's some recommendations that that we'd like to see happen. And those recommendations, if you could advance the slide, are in 4 categories. The first is policy. And so really, for example, we have an independent living stipend that we have in the state of New Jersey, and that policy had not been visited in 30-plus years. And so we had an opportunity to revamp it, but also consider, what does normalcy look like for a young person? What are those factors that we can encourage? So, for example, if a young person has to do a budget in order to receive the stipend, and it's important to us that we focus on promotive and protective factors, is it permissible or not for yoga classes to be an accepted part of their budget? And how do we look for and encourage those opportunities? And so our policy that launched in April really looks at that and creates space for young people to be able to do those things and to be able to do them with department support. The second category are placement resources, and in our system, that covers everything from resource homes, kin and non-kin, but also some group home settings, and then we have other licensed programs where our young people reside. And so really looking at how do the systems or the program model that those resources use, how does it create and promote promotive and protective factors? We also have been looking for, within our resource homes, especially those that serve older young people, to really look at how does the resource parent play a more pivotal role in kind of increasing and encouraging those examples. And so one way that's come up again, because it's one of my favorites on spirituality, is how do resource parents help young people kind of explore and engage in maybe not religious activities, but maybe some spiritual activities and exploration, and how do we, as a system, encourage resource parents to be comfortable having those conversations and to do so. The third column is in training, and so we have a pretty large staff, and so how do we look at ways of not just providing direct resources to casework staff, but also challenging the expansion of their thinking, again, not away from risk factors, because that's an important part of our work, but to make sure that we infuse those promotive and protective factors. And so if there are only 30 risk factors and 100 promotive and protective factors, how do we alter our mind space to really consider those proportions, to really look for ways of encouraging? And then the last is program models. And specifically, the report looks at potentially creating a specific model, like a specialized resource home model for older adolescents, looking for ways of bringing those factors in. And so really looking at a model where a youth biosocial and cognitive development and the impact of trauma, which has really been a huge part of our work lately, how does that show up in terms of how a resource parent provides care to a young person? And so the framework that was outlined in the slides, and then as Nilofer mentioned, really helped us challenge our thinking to say, well, we know what it's been, but if we're saying having knowledge of youth development is important in these 4 spheres, how do we make sure that it's there? And so it's been a really helpful process, and the report goes into a little bit more detail on those points. I just want to say before I transition that there are other parts of our department that are using other pieces of the framework, and so on our prevention side, we are looking at using the Strengthening Families piece or framework. Our work in adolescent services really focuses more on the Youth Thrive, the older adolescents piece. And so since there are no questions, I believe, until after me, that's my last slide.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that. We have now Brenda.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about Philadelphia's transition and how we are integrating, implementing, strengthening families. So for those of you that don't know, in Philadelphia, we completely overhauled the child welfare system as we used to know it. And so to that end, we wanted to achieve better outcomes for our children. And so we increased the parental responsibility and involvement. The focus was to sustain children in their own homes, include parents in the decision-making process, ensure the safety and well-being of children in their own homes, and provide services to families in their own communities. And so we initiated a process called Improving Outcomes for Children. And what that meant for Philadelphia is that we decentralized the child welfare agency to community agencies that we call community umbrella agencies, or the CUA. And so services that, including hotline and with the exception of hotline and investigation, all case carrying services move to the CUA or are in the process of moving to the CUA. And so all services that families in-home and out-of-home would receive would come from an agency that is in their own community, that we feel that parents would access services much more frequently and be more comfortable getting services if they could stay in their own community. That includes having children who had to be placed outside of their home temporarily be placed in their community, and so that when families were disrupted for whatever reason, there was support in the community, there was a sense of support in the community, and so we developed what we call CUAs. And to date, we have 7 CUAs, and by the end of this process in 2016, there will be 10. Another initiative that comes out of improving outcomes for children is that we move from a dual case system to a single case plan, one single family, single case plan, so that instead of families having multiple service providers from the various systems that they need services from, there would be one case manager who oversees the entire single case, so that if you have multiple children with multiple needs, there weren't a different social worker on each part of that case, but you had one single case and one family to one family. Another critical piece to improving outcomes for children is the teaming process. The teaming process says that a family, parent, and or a older youth must be involved in the decision-making process about their lives. The plans are made at a 20-day safety conference. It involves everybody who has anything to do with that case. It is the parent, it's the child, it is the supports, it is whoever the parent identifies as a support person, the therapist, are all at the table with the parent being the center of the focus, that the parent is the decision maker in his or her own case, that families, mom and dad, must be at the table to provide their input and their knowledge about what their family needs. To that end, we knew that we had to have a framework that would move past our past practice of identifying deficiencies rather than strengths. And so we looked at Strengthening the Families framework and saw that it aligned very nicely with what Improving Outcomes for Children was trying to do. And that is that the protective factors would promote those things that we saw in the families that we wanted to enhance in the families, which is looking at the strengths of the family as opposed to the deficiencies. And so in those areas, in addition to what you see on the screen, we also had to look at every part of our system and where strengthening families needed to be integrated. If you move to the next slide. Okay, so when you move to the next slide, you see that it's broken down into every part of our program. And so Nilifer had talked a few minutes ago about prevention and diversion. And so we looked at where in the prevention side did we need to implement the Strengthening Families framework. And so to that end, along with intake and investigations, we are now training the staff in both of those divisions to understand what the protective factors are, and that how to make sure that we're using the protective factors as we engage families, and how do those protective factors, when we know what they are and can identify them in the families, could prevent families from becoming involved in the system. With regard to intake and investigations, as Nilifer alluded to, protective capacities is part of our main tool for assessing safety. And so we looked at the safety model of practice, and we are now trying to integrate Strengthening Families language into the training process, which encompasses the safety practice, because our staff goes through a what we call charting the course, which is to improve practice. And so we've had to look at the protective capacities, which is part of the safety assessment, to say, how does this align with the protective factors? And what we know is that protective capacities are directly linked to the protective factors, that if we can identify in the family the protective capacities, we can better identify how we need to build on the protective factors. And so we saw that there was a real link between capacities and the protective factors. And so we're linked that to the investigations and intake piece, and uses it to focus on child well-being. And so that when we know that mom and or dad capacities are deficient, then we also look at what protective factors do do they have, and how do we build on these? And so there is a link there. Case planning is the one family single plan. Again, we looked at and have trained staff in working from behind the protective factors, so that you're looking at families when you're talking to them and interviewing them. You're identifying the strengths that mom has. You're looking at social connections or lack thereof. You're looking at mom's knowledge of child development, and so that you're better able to assess what does this mom need, what are the needs of this family, and in many cases we're hoping that in his or her own community they can access those services. Some of the assessment tools that I think was alluded to earlier that we looked at and ensured that we had strengthening families language in is the CANS assessment and the FAST. And so we looked at it and saw that many of the issues in the FAST CANS did actually work from behind the protective factors. So we were very careful and mindful of looking at all the tools that DHS currently and past used to assess families to ensure that protective factors were a part of the framework. We also moved to, as I said, the family team decision-making process. We found gave the family the voice that they did not have previously. It also allowed for all of the supports, both formal and informal, to be at the table to inform us as to how this case should proceed so that we could make the best decisions with mom and that we could keep the family in the community, whether the child stayed in home or had to be placed outside. The family would remain in its own community, and those resources would be accessible that way. We adjusted the policy and practice standards to support strengths-based, family-centered, and trauma-informed practice so that strengthening families' language is in the CUA, the Community Umbrella Agency, policy guidelines. The staff that they hire to work with families has to have knowledge of strengthening families. They are receiving it through, as I said, the charting the course class that many of them have to take before they can be certified. Additionally, we're working with them in the communities, in their strengthening families staff to ensure that the language is what we want, that we are watching how they do it, that they have really integrated this into their practice. Additionally, we have integrated this into, or we're beginning to integrate it into the performance evaluations so that in every aspect of DHS child welfare, we are ensuring that strengthening family language and protective factors is what is driving the work, that folks are working from behind the factors so that that is forevermost in their mind, looking at family strengths as opposed to the weaknesses or the deficiencies. A creation of new positions to support the practice change. We have in the CUAs, there's several positions in the CUAs that support the families that also those folks are being trained through my unit in strengthening families and protective factors work. One of the ways that we are also working with families to promote the protective factors is through the use of the parent cafe. We have found that parents thrive by in this environment because the cafe is an exchange of information. It meets the protective factors in many cases. Parents are often very isolated or don't have the connections that we assume that they do. The cafe serves as a tool for imparting the protective factors, helping families understand that they're not in this alone, and then forming bonds and connections that last a lifetime. And so the cafe also empowers families to have a voice for themselves, to advocate for themselves, and to be more involved in their community. So we are, at this time, the CUAs are now facilitating the cafes, and I think to date we've done probably about 15 cafes between the CUAs, and as I said, there's about 7 of them now. And so we're really supporting and encouraging the CUAs to develop this tool of integrating the protective factors in this transfer of learning with parents in the CAFE process. I think that, and as I said, we anticipate having 10 CUAs in every zip code in Philadelphia by 2016. We are currently have 7, and we're about to name the next 3 in the next couple weeks. We're very excited about this transition in Philadelphia. We really believe that giving the power back to parents and helping them be more involved in the decision-making process will achieve significant outcomes for our children, and it will help children stay at home or in their communities and lessen the amount of time that they're involved with our system.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brenda. Can you just, you said CUA, can you give us, what does that stand for, please, again?
The CUA is the Community Umbrella Agency.
Community Umbrella Agency. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Well, okay, so we have come to the time where we open up the lines. If anyone has any questions, you can fix your phone if you're interested in verbally giving your question, or you can also type it in if you don't want to say anything. You just want to type this question in into your little bar that's on your right-hand side, and I can read the question out for you. I did put here the contact information for Nilifer, Kelly, and also Brenda, so that if you have any questions for them after the presentation, and you feel free to email them so that they can answer you appropriately. So, are there any questions, any comments, or if someone's on the phone and want to share what you all are doing in your particular state or agency in regard to infusing protective factors in your daily work, please do. We would like to hear from you as well. Okay. I know, Brenda, you mentioned about training of the staff with the protective factors. Is there anything particular? I know that the National Children's Trust Fund, or National Alliance Children's Trust Fund,
National Alliance of Children's
Online Protective Factor program. Are you aware of that, or do you have someone coming in to do specific type of training?
So Nilifer and Juanita Blunt Clark from CSSP have been working probably the last 2 years with DHSU, which is the training arm of DHS, in terms of training and working with the safety, the charting the course, the safety model of practice. We're still in the process of trying to see how that's going to work out. But they've been working very closely with DHSU to ensure that there is strengthening families language in the training of new CUA staff, as well as intake and hotline staff.
Karen, our goal in Philadelphia was not to have a standalone strengthening families training, to have an introduction to strengthening families as workers came in, but then make sure that the ideas were all infused in the much more in-depth training that they received on their casework practice, so that it just became part of casework practice rather than something that you then had to translate into your casework practice. So that's why we're not using a standalone training like the Alliance's training, but rather doing this infusion method.
Okay. And then also, I don't know, Brenda, and I know, Nilifer, you touched on it too, about the assessment tools that's being used, and then also trying to make sure that the protective factors are also adapted into it. how does that work out? Because I know, if you recall, I don't know if you saw it or not, but there was an information memorandum went out about the assessment tools that Ryan Samuels at that time stated he wanted to see it be initiated across the board to make sure people concentrated also on the trauma that children may have and all of that. So I'm just trying to see whether or not that is a parallel to some of the things that was going on with the memorandum.
That's interesting. I don't know that I can answer that question off the top of my head, but similarly to what we just talked about training, in the work with assessment, what we've been really trying to do is integrate it into existing assessment processes. And I have a chart that I can share if folks want to email me, which actually lays out some of the work we're doing with existing developers of commonly used assessment tools in child welfare systems. Because, again, our intent or idea is it would be great if we could integrate into some existing assessment tools. In terms of the work on having trauma screeners integrated as part of assessment, that definitely comes up in some of the work that we do. So, for example, we worked pretty closely with Connecticut on their Early Childhood Child Welfare Linkages grant. And so when we were looking at the practice for those workers who had families with very young children in their caseload, we were including what are some of the questions that you might ask in order to have an understanding of whether or not that child has experienced trauma, whether they're manifesting trauma in their behavior, those type of things. And I think those questions were there in lieu of a specific screener because they had a good screener for the older kids, but not as much for the younger kids. So that was probably too detailed of a response for you, Sharon. But I do have a chart on the work we're doing on assessment if anybody on the phone wants to get in touch with us because they're interested in it.
Thank you. Are there any questions, comments?
I actually, with Kelly, I will email Kelly probably about this because she's doing significant work in Trenton, in Jersey, with Youth Thrive.
Yes, ma'am.
And we've been more focused on the family side, but we do have a center we call Achieving Independence Center, which works with youth from 14 to 21. And so we had talked a little bit about how to integrate or implement Youth Thrive in working with those youth. So I really would like to have some more conversation with you about how you're doing it in New Jersey because we really need to get that involved with our youth on this side.
And we're right across the river, so we can get a cheesesteak and figure it out.
That sounds good to me. Yeah. I'd be very interested to see how you guys did that. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is Rita Jones. I am with the Philadelphia Department of Human Services. I work under the leadership of Brenda Kinsler, and also have been working with Millifer and consulting about strengthening families and the implementation in Philadelphia. I just kind of wanted to add to the conversation about the Youth Thrive framework and the Achieving Independence Center. We actually have a teen cafe coming up on December the 30th at our Achieving Independence Center, so it would be great to connect with you, Kelly, prior to that to see if maybe we can collaborate on some ideas about how the cafe should go. We have done a teen cafe before. This would be our second one, but I would love to just pick your brain about some of your thoughts around the Youth Thrive framework and kind of help lead our team as we approach our second cafe.
Absolutely.
So, Brenda, if you could tag me in that email, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that was worked out. You was able to do some networking here.
Oh, yeah.
Today. That's great. Well, we are at 4:04, so we're a little bit over time, but I really do appreciate the fact that you took the time to share what you all are doing in New Jersey and Philadelphia, and what you are doing across the board. Again, this will be placed on the NRC In-Home Services website, as well as the webcast for those who did not come on the call, so they can actually get a chance to hear it. So with that, I thank you, and I hope that you will have a wonderful holiday and a new year.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
The host has left the meeting.